was me when I got out of bed, and I was like, "Oh, we're taking a picture of this." Uh, and people are like, "Are you okay?" I'm like, "Yeah, it's a joke. It's get it."
Total joke. People just didn't get that.
Yeah.
Hey, we are back here with our Saturday, day 2 keynote speaker, and I couldn't think of a better person to bring on to really deliver some great stuff out there for you guys here on the Mass Media Podcast Summit here. We are honored to have a Hall of Fame podcaster from the School of Podcasting, the man, the myth, the podcasting legend, Mr. Dave Jackson, joining us here on Mass Media Podcast. So, hey, man, glad to have you join us. It's probably a little colder up where you're at in Ohio today.
Hey,
huh?
Right now it's a beautiful thing. It is 34 degrees outside.
Yay.
So the beautiful thing, because it's been raining all day, and you do not have to shovel rain. So I will take it. It's because a lot of times in January you're like, okay, Christmas is over, we're ready, and it's like, no, and you just get hammered. But no, we've been very lucky so far this year. And part of it is because I bought a show snoveler, yes, or a snow shoveler, take your pick. And because I bought one and was prepared, we've had very little snow. So what?
That's good. Well, that's every year. It's like going and getting a flu shot and then not getting sick.
That's it.
Right? Good stuff. Well, we're excited about this topic. I know that we got people hanging around who want to find out the mistakes that podcasters are making. But I got to tell you, I love the videos of where you call people like that. Another piss poor podcast pitch. The most recent one you put up was really good.
Oh, I love the way my favorite is, and I always want to go, does that work? Because somebody sent this one happened to go to a friend of mine, and she's like, oh, I've got to forward this to you because you're going to pop a cork. And people will contact me and they'll say, first of all, if they even use my name, I'm amazed. Usually it's like, hello, I want to let you know I love your show. To which I always want to reply, hello, which one? I have 6. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And then they go on, and it's all about them. I have cured cancer. I have adopted children from third world. Just look at me. I am so great. All the time, not connecting on how their expertise matches what you actually talk about. I just had one today that was, they were pitching some sort of like Instagram person. And I'm like, maybe, but it's like, I'm about growing my podcast audience, not really growing my Instagram audience, which I realize a big Instagram audience might then help my podcast. But if I've got to connect the dots, you didn't do your job. So
there you go.
It was pretty. So that's an example of a mistake that people are making. The one that doesn't win me any fans when well, first of all, I think do I have my boring slide in here? Yes. Scott, we're going to go through the boring slide. All right.
That's fine, man. That's fine.
I'll go through it quick. I've been podcasting since 2005. I started the School of Podcasting. Currently, I think it's 2.7, but we'll call it 2.1 for now. It's an old slide. I currently work for Libsyn. I actually got my job because of my podcast, which was kind of cool. I have a book right now called More Podcast Money. I have another one coming out this year called Profit from Your Podcast. And that happened in 2018 where they inducted me into, as Scott mentioned, into the Hall of Fame. I had to put on a suit and everything for that.
So quite snazzy there, man.
Yeah, but these are in no apparent order. This is just, I threw them on the wall and like, yep, this is thing. So Scott, because you have a microphone and you're here with me, can you think of, like, when you think of a scam, what would be a scam that's like that? It 3 words. And if you get this right, I think you win something.
Oh, really?
It's almost like
Prince.
Oh, see, that would be good. Get rich quick.
Yeah.
When I hear people say, I want to start a podcast, and people think I'm making this up, and they go, I'd like to quit my job in 6 months or 6 weeks. And I understand. Usually that's because they really hate their job. And I'm like, that's about as likely to happen as well. That, a lovely unicorn with wings and that whole 9 yards. And people don't want to hear that. They want, and there are people that make lots of money because they tell you what you want to hear. I'm like, follow your passion and you will be, driving a Porsche in 6 months. And, you'll be on Jimmy Fallon and Jimmy Kimmel and, anybody named Jimmy with a TV show, you will be on. And I'm just here to tell you, there are people that get huge downloads. And we actually have an example of this when we talk about quick here. first of all, the other one is crowdfunding. Now, you notice this says fund crowding. This is where people, again, if we go back to getting rich quick, and they go, well, let's see, if I have 400 downloads an episode, and that's cool, rule number one. People, we'll throw, this is a bonus mistake. We'll throw in a couple one. A big one is comparing yourself to other podcasters.
Yeah.
That will suck the life right out of you. I've had people, they're like, I can't believe this. 400 people are listening to my podcast. I didn't think anybody was going to listen. And then somebody will go into a Facebook group and say, I just went over 2 million. And they're like, oh, I'm melting. You know, it's like, so, but what they'll try to do is they get so focused on making money that they kind of forget to build, you monetize your audience. So I always say it's not fun crowding, it's crowdfunding. And so you have to build the crowd first. And when you say things like, okay, I'm going to get, I have 400 people per episode, because a lot of people love to quote, monthly stats, and they'll say, oh man, I get 5,000 downloads an episode. And you're like, wow. Now to me, I do one a week. So I'm thinking that's 1,250 an episode roughly. And then you find out that they do one every day, and you go, wait, what's 5,000 divided by 30 that's 167 downloads an episode. There's a big difference between 1,300 and 167. Yep. So when you hear people quoting monthly and daily and weekly stats, it's the number you want to look at is episode. How many downloads per episode, typically after 30 days. And so let's say you have 400 downloads after 30 days, and you go, man, if I could get half of my people to give me $10, that would be 200 people. That'd be $2,000 a month. Like that's a chunk of change. And that would be awesome if you would get 50%, but you're not going to get 40 or 30 or 20, maybe in a really, really weird, like maybe 10 if you're like the golden child, but usually it's like 3 to 5%. Patreon,
direct mail has like the same amount of numbers, 1 to 4% return rate. Yeah.
Patreon says it's expect about 5%. And
bad.
From the people I've seen, they say it's usually more like 3. And then if you're using Patreon, and there are more companies coming out now that kind of have this, make it easy to give your audience, or make it easier for your audience to give you money. But Patreon right now said the average crowdfunding person gives you $7 a month. So, I was thinking I was going to get 200. And if we do what I say, 400 times 0.3% is 12 people times 7 is $84. And it's kind of hard to live on $84 a month. So, and I don't know if I did that or you did that, but I can't hear you, Scott.
That's me. Sorry. I was grabbing a Coke here real fast. That's almost $1,000 in a year.
Yeah, almost. So that's rule number one. Don't, you kind of get stuck on making money when rule number one is build your audience. And that's the one that nobody wants to hear. They're like, no, I want to get to the money part. I'm like, me too. But you gotta, I like money just as much as the next person, but you got to get that audience first. The second one is there is a difference between recording and content creation. We all understand record. If we all go back, Scott, are you old enough to remember these?
Yes. Tape players. Yes.
That is a cassette deck for you that are under 20. Back in the day, my mom once tortured me because I threw like the fit of all fits, like Oscar winning, screaming, banging your head, the whole 9 yards. My mom is just cool as a cucumber. And so I finally like take a breath, and she goes, are you done? And I go, yeah, I guess. And she moved the Kleenex box and hit stop on that cassette deck. And I was like, oh. And she goes, I'm playing that for your dad when he gets home. And I was like, I'll be good, honest. But we've been pressing record for a while. So whether it's a VCR, remember those, and a cassette deck, now we press record on DVRs and things like that. So we could just record a conversation. And a lot of people are like, yeah, man, we're keeping it real. But just because it's real doesn't mean it's really good. It means, and sometimes we get lost with that. Like, man, me and my buddy just laugh all the time. Well, that's because you've got 10 years of inside jokes. So when it comes to content creation, the first thing you want to do is listen. You have to figure out who your audience is. And the more specific you can get on that, the better. So if you go, well, I'm doing a show about weight loss, so I need to talk to people who are overweight. Okay. But if you go overweight men, female, ages 40 to 50, because there's a difference between somebody losing weight at age 20 and somebody losing weight at age 50. It's a heck of a lot harder at age 50. And then men and women have different kind of things going on. So, and the thing is, we want to be everything to everyone. And when you do that, that's another mistake. The more niche you get, you're going to end up with a smaller number, but a stronger influence. One of my favorite examples of this, she doesn't do the show anymore because things in her life just got a little out of control. But it was Kathy Kelly did Special Mouse, and she has a son who's pretty high on the autism spectrum, but she loves Disney. So she did a show on how to take people with special needs to Disney. And so the people that found her show were like, oh, I thought I was the only person going through this. And her numbers were nowhere near the 5,000 you need for a sponsor, but she got a sponsor. Why? Because she found a sponsor who specializes in transporting people with special needs. So it's not always about the numbers. But when you go to create this content, you got to listen. What does your audience need? What are they talking about? And what are their biggest hurdles? And you can do this in things like Facebook groups, LinkedIn groups. I hear are coming back. I'm not sure that's entirely. I'll believe that when I see it. Last time I was over there was still a lot of spam. Reddit is another place that you can go and see what people are talking about. Meetup.com. I actually have a local Northeast Ohio meetup. And again, it's not the numbers. I have maybe 10 people that show up to that, but one of those 10 got me on TV. So it's not always the numbers, it's the quality of that. So you figure out what these people are doing and what do they need, what are their biggest hurdles, and those types of things. And I would say it's a little bit like a gift. Your podcast should be a gift. And so have you ever had Scott, have you ever done a Secret Santa?
Yep.
Yeah. And it's always fun because you're like, oh, cool. And then you pull the name and you go, oh, great. I got Harold from accounting. I don't even work in accounting, man. I'm like, who's Harold? That guy. Okay, great. Well, I have no idea what to get Harold for Christmas. So what am I going to do? I'm going to go ask somebody in accounting, like, what is Harold into? And they're like, oh, he loves the Philadelphia Eagles. And I'm like, oh, cool. I'll get him a jersey. So I had to figure out what he wanted. And then you give it to him. And really, that's what your podcast is. You go to these groups, you go to events, find out what people are talking about, and then you just give it to them. And so when Harold opens up his gift and goes, wow, this is a kick butt jersey, he's like, I want you to be my Secret Santa every year. So it really, not to oversimplify, but it is figuring out what your audience wants and then give it to them. The other thing you have to figure out is, why are you doing this? Because I could do a show that inspires people, and like, I'm going to interview people that have gone from rags to riches. And here's another one, rags to riches, and great. And it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, but what's in it for you? And if you're like, oh, well, I'm a coach, I'm a life coach, and I could help people overcome their struggles. Well, you better start pimping yourself in that podcast, because if nobody knows that, and so it's one of those things where here's my audience, here's my goal, what's in the middle that's going to hold the attention of my audience, but also further the goal that you have for starting the podcast in the first place. So, you make it a gift, you do some planning, and I have a screenshot here. It says the Second City. This was in Chicago, and Second City is where a lot of people from Saturday Night Live have come from. There's an improv group in Canada that I can't remember, but these are people that do improv for a living. And I went there, and I'm going to say a good 60% of the evening was horrible. Like, I was like, whoa, what? I can't, this is going to be hilarious. Now, the things that were hilarious. And it was kind of interesting that they were literally just pulling things right out of their butt. They're like, give us a topping, to be like a banana, a paper towel, and Uber. And they'd be like, okay, let's make this into a sketch. So it was interesting that they somehow put things together, but that doesn't mean they were always interesting. So my point is, you need to have a plan. Like today, I did an interview of an author, and one of the things that he says in his book is you have to figure out, like, why am I bringing this person on? And what's the one question that person can answer that nobody else can? Because otherwise, why are you bringing them on? Mm-hmm. And it comes back to knowing who my audience is, so I can ask the questions that they would ask, and you kind of go through it. Now, a lot of an interview is asking that first really good question, getting the ball going in the direction you want it to go, and then just listening. But the whole like, oh, we'll just turn on the mics and go. I'm like, man, if professionals kind of like some of the time, you think you're gonna, don't know. So I always tell people, have an idea. And to me, I think I did an experiment and I looked at everything I watched or listened to or read or whatever it was. And I'm like, why am I watching this TV show? Why am I reading this book? Why am I listening to this podcast? And it all came down to everything I consumed either made me laugh, cry, think, groan, educate, or entertain. And so and if you can do multiples of those, like I love John Oliver on HBO last week tonight. It's a new show. It's super educational and it's hilarious. So if you can do multiples of those, now you've got something on. But if you go, well, I don't know, we could talk about French toast recipes, and you're like, this isn't even a cooking show. That's okay. Don't press record yet. You're not quite ready. You need to come up maybe with a little plan. And the other thing you want to do is do a little research. I went into Apple Podcasts, or in this case, iTunes, and did a search for the phrase outside the box. And I think it's funny that there are many people that never went outside the box to see if anybody's using the name outside the box. And they're actually more than this. Here's one doesn't even have artwork. That's a whole other thing. Here's one, somebody went crazy and added the word thinking in front of it. But there's 5 podcasts called Outside the Box. And I'm like, okay, somebody didn't do any research, any planning, things like that. It doesn't happen a lot, but there may be times when you find a podcast that is using your name that you want to use, and they haven't done an episode in like 3 years. You might be able to contact them and say, hey, like, can I give you a couple shekels for your podcast and I'm going to take it over? And some cases they will say yes. And in some cases they're like, no, I might bring it back someday, but it's worth a shot. But the other thing is, you just don't want to, it's just a hassle when you're already competing with somebody with the exact same name. It's like they're something else you might want to come up with a new idea. The other thing is, it's not the technology. Boy, do podcasters love technology, said the guy sitting here with 2 more microphones in front of him and, all sorts of stuff. And unless your podcast sounds like it was made with 2 cans and some string, and your audience is saying, wow, this is unlistenable, it's not. And I have a term for this. It's called casturbation. And what this is, it's where you feel like you're being busy. You're doing this and you're going to redo this and that, but none of it has to do with focusing on your audience and making better content. And that's where you'll have somebody have like an Audio-Technica ATR 2100 microphone, which is a good microphone, and then they'll go, well, maybe I should get the RE320, which is what I'm talking into. And really, there's like $300 difference between these 2 microphones, but there's not $300 difference in sound. It's really not. Yes, this is a better microphone, but it's not that much better. And again, unless your audience is really saying, wow, that sounds horrible, because you've got a Blue Yeti in the middle of a table set up to pick up in every direction and you're in another state talking into it, it's not the technology. I've never had anybody call me up and say, Dave, you got to listen to this podcast. I'm like, what's the name of it? And they're like, oh, it's, the Scott Carson Hour. You got to check it out. I'm like, great. What's so great about it? And they're like, oh, his sound is awesome. It's like butter for your ears. I've never had somebody say that. It's always like, you won't believe this. They're talking about, what's happening in Congress, or there's a new way to, I'm working with a client right now, and it's all about children's health. And I'm learning so much about technology. And I'm like, why isn't this anywhere? That's the kind of stuff that gets people to share your content. So busting the budget is not going to make your show any better. I always politely say you can't polish a turd. And if your content isn't any good, it doesn't matter if it's in stereo or mono or whatever. And in reality, I usually tell most people, because they're like, well, how much money does it take to start a podcast? I say about the price of an Xbox. By the time you get a couple microphones that are around $70 a piece, maybe an interface, which is like another 100, and a couple pop filters, and you can use Audacity, it's free. You don't have to break the budget. I actually had a client once that hired me, and we get on Zoom, and he's got all these lights and the whole room is, that sound absorption. And he bought this like $2,000 DSLR camera. And I'm like, great. I go, so tell me about your podcast. And he's like, yeah, that's the part I'm stuck on. I can't pick my topic. And I was like, wow, we have the cart, way, way, way behind. It was like, so, and he'd spent literally like $2,000. And I'm like,
Oh.
you don't have to start there. So, keep that in mind. If you're thinking that, I need to spend $5,000 to get good sound, you can spend $80 with this microphone and you're good to go. Even less if you get a Samson Q2U. So, the other thing to keep in mind, one size fits all. And as you see in this picture, no, it does not. I have a microphone in my closet that I bought because I can't remember his last name, Scott, something. This is way back in 2005. And he just had this voice that just was like the announcer guy. And I'm like, I want to sound like Scott. And I'm like, Scott, what microphone do you have? And it's the AKG something, something, something. And I went and got it. It's like $300 microphone. And I got it. And oddly enough, did not make me sound like Scott. And it's actually, Scott is a professional voiceover guy. And so he has like a booth that he kind of has this makeshift in his house. It was picking up everything in my house. Like if a cricket was outside, it was picking it up. And I was like, oh, so buying what, I see a lot of people want to buy the exact same setup that Joe Rogan has. And I'm like, that is not going to make you Joe Rogan. So keep that in mind. It's nice to be inspired by people and see what they're using. But in the end, a lot of times I kind of joke about it when people go and they'll ask a question about podcasting. And I'm like, well, I hate to say this again, but it depends. Because if you're doing a podcast and there's two people in the same room, well, then I would say get a Focusrite USB interface. But if you and your co-host are in another state, well, then you could get, a Samson Q2U, an ATR 2100, and you could use Squadcast to record that way. There's like always multiple answers for the same thing. So be careful if somebody goes, oh, here, just buy this package. Because I've usually seen where sometimes packages, you end up buying a lot of stuff that you don't need. So be careful with that. And then the other one is not having a budget. So we've gone from blowing the budget to not having a budget. So I'm trying to do everything for free. And I think we're up to 6 media hosts now that have gone out of business, because it turns out if you don't charge your customers for your product, it's hard to stay in business. And some people are like, well, I want to start off going super cheap because what if this doesn't work? And I'm like, hey, how about we don't plan to fail?
Yeah.
That's just not a good way to go. And I realize that, that doesn't, again, mean that we go out and blow thousands of dollars. And I said something a couple weeks ago, and I said, this isn't going to go over well, but I got to speak the truth. If you come to me and say, look, I'm thinking of going with, Libsyn, Blueberry, Podbean, whatever, and it's, let's say $15, and you're like, man, $15 a month. Like, I don't know if that's going to work. And to me, I'm like, if $15 is going to bust your budget, and I can say this, I've been bankrupt. I grew up at a time I was on welfare. I know there's a difference between being poor and being broke. And I understand what it's like to be broke. And if you're in a situation where $15 is going to break you, it's not. It says something and then come back and get, do your podcast. But that's one that I'm like, you got to do. You can't do it for free. So, and Scott, I'm going to double check here because my internet is yelling at me. Am I okay?
You're still good. You had a little blip there, but I think you're okay. Everything sounds fine in this end.
Okay.
We had just a little short blip, so no biggie.
All right. Yeah, hopefully that doesn't happen anymore. On occasion, our good friends at Spectrum just give me the worst service they can, throw my way.
Yeah, I thought that was what Spectrum meant. Worst service.
Yes, exactly. And you want to make sure to use the right tool for the job. So I always kind of jokingly say, don't try to paint with peanut butter. It's just not a good move. It's not designed that you can. If you want to paint with peanut butter, you can. It's just not a good idea. So I've had people like, oh, can I use Dropbox as my media host? I'm like, that's not what Dropbox is designed. Can I use my website as a media host? No, that's not. You can. It just eventually it's going to break or something like that. So not having a budget. So there's both ends of the spectrum there. There's spending thousands of dollars thinking that this will make the show great. And then there's the other end where like, I'm not going to spend any money. Well, you have to spend some money. I always say, even if, if your hobby is bowling, you're still renting shoes, or, if it's golf, boy, if you golf, that is not a cheap hobby. So don't get too tight with the purse strings there, and realize you're having fun, and fun is worth paying for. The fifth one is realistic expectations. And this is where I've had people that in some cases are somewhat quasi celebrity, like they're known in their industry, but the problem is their industry doesn't listen to podcasts yet. So they'll start a podcast and they're like, well, there must be something wrong with your numbers, because I mean, do you know who I am, kind of thing? And you're like, yeah, but your audience doesn't listen to podcasts. It's things like that. So it is going to be something where they talk about the long tail. And I always tell people, it's, if you can just every episode, hey, if you could do me a favor, if you could just tell one person about the show this week, that would be great. And you'll see your numbers go up and up, but you have to ask for it. But again, we all kind of, we kind of grow up in a microwave society where, we want it now and we don't like to wait. And I get that. Just like I'm looking for that 10,000 download golden switch that you just walk over and you push it up and 10,000 downloads. I'm like, yay, I haven't found it yet. But here's a great example of just how, you just keep putting in your time. And I always like to use Jerry Seinfeld. Most of us have heard of him, seen the show in reruns. It took him 4 years to get on the Tonight Show. This is back in the days of Johnny Carson. So for you youngins, Johnny Carson was before Jay Leno, who was before Jimmy Fallon. So this is a while ago. But back then, if you could get on the Tonight Show, it literally would make your career. It was life-changing. Like you would go down the street, nobody knew who you were. You'd go on the Tonight Show, you'd go down the street, and everybody's like, oh my God, I saw you on Johnny last night. Because that's back when there were like 4 stations. I feel like I'm talking about the Stone Age. But anyway, so it took him 4 years just to get a shot. Then he did an awesome job, would get asked over to the couch by Johnny for 9 years. So that's now 9 plus 4 is 13. So he's got 13 years before they gave him the show. Then the television show actually didn't do good at all, as much as it's in reruns. In fact, it was almost canceled. So there's another 4. That's 17 years, not weeks, not months, 17 years before it, quote, became big or huge or a hit. So keep that in mind. 17 years for Seinfeld to be a hit. So when you say, hey, I'm ready for this thing, I've been doing it 8 months, and I'm like, well, good on you. You got, and that doesn't mean it's going to take you 17 years, but it's going to take longer than 6 months. And so there's a great book called Beyond Powerful Radio by Valerie Geller. And she says, basically it takes 3 years to build an audience. And I've known some people, Natalie Ekdahl does Biz Chicks, Chicks with an X. And it took her about 3. She now does her own conferences for women. She has a very specific audience. She talks to women CEOs, people that are making 6 figures. And she's now got this huge consulting business. Darren Dake does the Coroner podcast. And he actually now has developed his own school to certify coroners. But it took both those people about 3 years. So I always tell people, if you're really doing this as a business, and I just got a weird noise in my head, so that means we're probably going to have a glitch. So let me know if I need to repeat something. Okay. But anyway, so it took both those people about 3 years, and there are more, and there are always going to be people that do a little less and a little more, but it does take more than 6 months. The other one, and I just ran into this one, a big mistake, is you go, I'm not getting any feedback, but you make it impossible to contact you. At the end of the year, I do the same episode, and I ask my audience, what's your favorite podcast? If you could only listen to one, what's your favorite podcast this year and why? Because I want to understand why people listen and what did this podcast do to build loyalty? And what I will do then is contact that podcast to say, hey, Joe Schmo thinks your podcast was the best. If they were giving out awards, you would get one. And I'm amazed that when I go to these websites, I cannot find a contact page anywhere. And I'm like, oh, this is, the whole goal is to build that relationship with your audience. And if you put up walls, it's like, ugh, because it's kind of weird, as much as that I know that that I know that I put my shoes on one at a time. When you actually email one of your listeners, they're like, oh my gosh, the guy from the podcast just emailed me, and they'll go tell 2 friends and things like that. So make it super easy to contact you, and then make sure it works. I've seen people do this. They'll have a contact form and they'll just add it, but somewhere behind the scenes, you had to put in your email address. So it's blasting it to like sample@example.com. And you're like, no, that's going nowhere. So make sure it's easy to contact you, and then answer every email, every comment, every tweet, whatever it is. Because again, that's gonna, your listeners when you first start off are kind of your sales force. So the more you can stoke the fire on that, the better. Your first impression is another one that people just blow all the time. And a buddy of mine, Eric K. Johnson from podcast Talent Coach, has a great analogy. He says, nobody gets on a bus where if you don't know where it's going. And so many people start off their podcast and don't tell you where you're going. And you're like, what am I listening to? So this should be like, what is your show about? Welcome to the blah, blah show where we blah, 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 blah. Today on the show, we're going to be talking about yada, yada, yada. So right there within the first minute, I know what the show's about. I know what we're going to be talking about today, and I can decide if I want to listen or not. And people are like, well, I don't want them to tune out. No. If you actually are honest with somebody and say, today I'm doing a show for absolute beginner podcasters, all the veteran people are going to tune out, and they're actually happy because I didn't waste 20 minutes of their time, and they'll come back next week to hear what's going on. So,
or they'll go listen to another show versus just going to somebody else's show. Right.
Right. Exactly. You might want to let your audience know why should they listen to you, because there are a lot of podcasts. And so, people always say, why do you start off your show, podcasting since 2005? I'm like, because not everybody can say that, or whatever. I kind of, and it's hard because we have a hard enough time kind of talking about ourselves, let alone kind of strutting our stuff and things like that. But you got to let people know, like, here's why you should listen to me. If you're trying to do kind of a business podcast, things like that, especially if you're voicing an opinion or you're giving advice, they're like, wait a minute, why should I listen to this person? Let your audience know what your co-host sounds like. So this is where, I could say, hey, joining me, I'm Dave Jackson, and joining me over there is Scott. Scott, how's it going, buddy?
It's going wonderful.
See, now everybody knows what Scott sounds like. And so they can kind of put those two and two together. Another first impression that happens is today we're going to talk about how you can turn $20 into $2,000. But first, I want to talk about this. And then they go into something else. And you're like, and I always say, when you go to Walmart, that greeter doesn't go, hey, welcome to Walmart. Hold on a second. Wait till I tell you about this squirrel that can water ski. And you're like, no, I need to know where the milk is and the bread. And they're like, no, wait till you hear about, no, don't get to the, if you listen to the news, our top story tonight will be on TV in about 20 minutes. First, we're going to hand it to Dale, who's going to talk about what's going on. You're like, wait, what? So get to the point. And if you don't believe that's true, the next time you watch Netflix and you get to the end and it says next episode, not only does it skip and go to the next episode, it skips the next episode's intro. It goes right to the meat and potatoes. And I'm like, so if anybody goes, wait, I'm like, yeah, that's case closed. That's example of people just want to get to the next thing. This is not good. This is an example of a first impression where they forgot their album artwork. And that just screams, well, if you don't care about your artwork, I'm pretty sure you don't care about your content either. And I love the fact that it's called Ask the Experts, because I'm like, really? So another mistake you can make and what's really odd is this is a very popular show, but their episode numbers are episode 123, episode 122. And the last time I checked, nobody was Googling episode 123. And I've seen people that have tripled their downloads by making better headlines. And what a lot of people do is they will put the name of your show in the title, and then they'll put something like episode 123. Whereas if it was, Dave Jackson Hour, episode number 16, interview with Puh, and then you run out of room because you've only got so many characters. Well, if I'd started with just the today, what if it was Paul McCartney? An interview with Puh is really Paul McCartney. I'm dating myself again, but nonetheless, we don't care what episode number it is. And you don't need to put the name of your show again, because here's another slide where somebody has done this. The name of the show is Encore, the best of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And they've got the title of the show in the title of their episode, and then the name of the guest. And you could just make it so much better. And I always use the analogy of TV and radio. When you turn those on, something happens. When you start a podcast app, nothing happens. And what makes you click? The headline. So, episode 123 doesn't make me want to click, but if it says, something that's very specific to whatever I'm trying to learn or whatever. So you got to have a good first impression. Number 8 is your last impression. And this is where people make their audience drool, because they're like, all right, hey, that's going to do it for this episode. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at Dave Jackson and on Instagram at schoolofpodcasting.com. And don't forget to sign up for the newsletter and and you're like, and subscribe to me on and Twitter and Spotify. And they're like, oh, ugh. You got to have one call to action. And this is hard. I personally struggle with this one myself, because it's hard to say, what's the one thing I want my audience to do? Because I'm like, well, I want them to subscribe to the show, because as much people love ratings and reviews, it's really subscribers that's what counts. So I really want them to subscribe, but I really want them to sign up for my School of Podcasting, or I really want them. And I'm like, you got to kind of pick one. Or what some people do is I will call it the call to action sandwich. And so you'll go, well, hey, thanks so much for any questions. Come out, visit me at schoolofpodcasting.com. All my contact information is out there, Twitter and Facebook, and you can sign up for the newsletter and all that. It's all there, schoolofpodcasting.com. So really the call to action is website. You just put a whole bunch of stuff in the middle. And I'm like, okay, I guess that would work. But the problem is when you just start spouting all these things, it's like your audience can't remember all that. Then the other mistake here, we're up to number 9, is feedback. And my favorite quote, there's a master class with Steve Martin, and he says, so many people are asking, how do I get a manager? Or how do I get an agent? And he goes, nobody's asking, how do I get good? And that's really it. And I've had people that I'll talk to, and I'm like, well, so what kind of feedback are you getting? They're like, oh man, I played it for my friends and my family. They all said it was great. I'm like, yeah, that's the problem. Because mom's never going to say, oh, honey, that was awful. That's just not, if it is, kudos for mom for giving you some tough love. But if you can find people that you think would be your target audience, and it's tough, but just say, look, here, I want you to listen to this and then talk about it like I'm not in the room. I'm really looking to make a podcast that you would want to listen to. And I can't do that if you don't tell me what I'm doing right and what I'm doing wrong. And the problem is, podcasting is a little bit like an art. And so you put some time and effort into it, you put it out, and somebody goes, ugh, that's a tough pill to swallow. And I think that's why most people don't do that. But the problem is, then, we'll talk about this in a minute. No amount of promotion is going to save a bad podcast.
Yeah.
So you've got to have the courage to get some feedback and know if it's good or not. But speaking of promotion, I think this movie came out in 87. It's old, but Field of Dreams had this line in it: if you build it, they will come. And so many people think that is that's the podcast marketing strategy. If I can just get an Apple Podcast. And I'm like, well, Apple Podcast really is like it's a phone book. For those of us that remember the phone book, it's a listing. And I'm not famous because I'm in the phone book. So consequently, being an Apple Podcast is not going to make it famous either. It makes it easier to be found. And on the screen here, I have the coveted new and noteworthy. And there are so many people that just obsess over this. And I say, look, if you obsess over making good content and connecting with your audience, you're going to end up in new and noteworthy. But if you focus on new and noteworthy and ignore your audience. And the other thing I found is Libsyn actually had a podcast on not in new and noteworthy, on the front page of Apple iTunes. You open it up, they have those big rectangle boxes at the top. They had one there, and a couple hundred downloads after a couple of weeks. It wasn't this huge spike. So not that I wouldn't take a couple hundred downloads, but it's not what you think. And then some people think, well, what I'll do for promotion is I'll just do a swap. You rate my podcast, I'll rate yours. And I'm like, wait, if you can't get your audience to leave you an honest review, that is a red flag, my friends. It's like, and plus, I mean, I can smell them a mile away when you go over to somebody's podcast and like, that's really odd. On August 17th, they got 15 reviews all saying, great show, love the host, or great podcast, love it. There's nothing specific about it. And I'm like, yeah. And they're all on August 17th. That's how odd that is. So reviews are great. They are social proof. They can also completely sap your life when you get your first 1-star review, because there's always going to be that one person. But just realize it's social proof. The only time I've ever heard a legit reason for like really freaking out about reviews is there was one sponsor that looked at your reviews to see if you actually had an engaged audience. And I was like, all right, that would be a reason to have reviews. But so many people obsess over that. But really the bottom line is the things that move the charts are total number of downloads. And you get that by getting subscribers. So you want to teach your audience how to subscribe, because that is where the rubber hits the road. That's where, as soon as you put out an episode, it's going to show up, because a lot of times you can put out, right now as we speak, you can put out a new episode, and Apple is having some wonkiness going on where it's not showing up in your Apple listing, but if you subscribe, your episode is there. That is normal, but it's taking a little longer than the normal long it takes, if that makes any sense. It's usually about 24 hours for it to update. It's taking a little longer. So people are like starting to freak out. And that's where you're like, no, always subscribe to your own show. That will save you a lot of headaches. So the other thing about promotion, again, kind of dating ourselves here, but if you want to watch a really bad movie, Johnny Depp, I forget what year this came out, was in The Lone Ranger. And this had so much promotion about it. I mean, we had Happy Meals ready. We had action figures, the whole 9 yards. And I saw this movie in the theaters, and it was horrendous. It was not good. It was bad. Some Native Americans were offended by Johnny Depp's attire. There was everything that went wrong with this. And it didn't matter how many commercials they ran. This thing did not do a lot. Now, if you look at The Sixth Sense, this is almost an independent film that came out, and everybody that saw this movie told their friends, you've got to go see this movie. In fact, you're coming with me. I want to see it again. And, it didn't, that one was strictly on word of mouth. And I think it's Jacobs Media came out with a report, I guess now 2 years ago in 2018, 70% of people find podcasts through word of mouth. It's not being in Apple iTunes. It's when you make content that makes people want to tell their friends and they go, no, you got to listen to this. That's where you're going to grow your audience. And that again goes back to knowing who your audience is and what do they want. So as we start to kind of wrap things up here a little bit, podcasting it's not easy. It's easy to start a podcast. Look, I could fire up Anchor and make a podcast right now. That's not the problem. The problem is making a good podcast. So it can take a lot of time to do that research and find out who your audience is and things like that. It can lead to relationships that can change your life forever. I have a job because of my podcast. I get to travel all over the place now talking about podcasts. Why? Because my podcast was a business card. It's not my business. It's my business card. And so it can also lead to bitter disappointment when you get that 1-star review that says a really bad show for a really bad product. You're like, oh, that hurts. But you have to realize that, hurt people, I think is the fun-filled buzz phrase about that. Also remember, your podcast is a recipe. It's not a statue. So if you start off, and I have a friend of mine that did a podcast. He thought it was going to be primarily male 35-year-old entrepreneurs listening to a show. Instead, it was 40 to 45-year-old females. So he was like, well, I don't know why this is attracting this audience, but this is the audience I have. So I'm going to double down on that. So he just kind of switched it up a little bit. But in the end, is podcasting, is it worth it? Well, to this, I always say, well, let's look at babies, right? Having a child, last time I checked, not easy. A lot of effort, a lot of nights working late. It takes a lot of time, 18 years in some cases to get them out of the house. Having a child leads to relationships that can change your life forever. And having a child can also, in some cases, lead to bitter disappointment. You're like, wait, what? I remember once my mom bought me a brand new, wasn't a hand-me-down from my brother, brand new winter coat. And it was somehow kind of nylon. And we went ice skating. She said, whatever you do, don't get too close to the big giant heater that they have where, it's this big metal thing they put. And boy, I got right up next to that thing. My entire back of my coat just melted. So that was a case of bitter disappointment for my mom. She's like, oh man, you idiot. Having a child is not a recipe. It is a recipe, not a statue. So, if your kids start to head a little left, you can, try to steer them a little right. They have their own mind. It's a little different, but the point is, if they, doing one thing, it's not too late to maybe change them a little bit. But in the end, having a child is definitely worth it. And so I always like to one of the stories I always like to share is I started in 2005. I'd gone through a bankruptcy and I'd gone through a divorce. So, 2005 was a banner year in the Jackson household. And I, luckily enough, I had a brother that was a saint. He said, look, just come live with me for a little bit till you get back on your feet. So I was podcasting out of my brother's basement next to the water heater and a furnace, and lucky me, a flush pipe was right behind me. So I had to time things just right. And, I start this podcast thing, didn't know where it was going to go. And I got this email from a guy once that said, hey, I want to let you know I found your podcast. And I'm so glad I did. He goes, because my best friend of like 25 years was killed suddenly. And I had been to the doctor and I was pretty sure I had cancer and I lost my job. And he goes, my favorite day of the year is Halloween. And I decided in 2017, which is when this happened, he goes, I was going to take my gun and kill myself on Halloween. He goes, but I heard your podcast and you said sometimes podcasting can give you a purpose. And he said, so I thought, well, okay, let me try this podcasting thing. He goes, so I started a podcast, and he goes, and obviously I've talked to some people. I needed a little bit of help, but I just want to let you know, I don't want to kill myself anymore. And it's all because of your podcast. And it's hard to make me speechless. And I was like, this is not what I started a podcast for, but I'm so glad I did. And what was great is he put his phone number in his signature. So on Halloween, I called him up. And I'm like, hey, is this Ryan? And he's like, yeah. And I'm like, this is Dave Jackson. He's like, get out of here. Seriously? And I'm like, yeah. I go, look, man, I need all the downloads I can get. I can't have anybody, I need you to keep listening. And I call him every Halloween now. It's like awesome. Our thing, just to keep it up. So you never know what you're going to, run into. You never know who you're going to affect. And if you need any help with your podcast, you can go over to schoolofpodcasting.com/subscribe. Or if you're on your phone, just text SOP to 31996. That is my one call to action, trying to live up to my own words here. But I appreciate you taking the time to watch this. And Scott, I appreciate you taking the time to have me on. And I'm not sure where we go from here. Do we have questions or?
Yeah, let's open up for those. We got a couple questions here. Michelle Smith just says, wow, powerful story in your last one. She goes, LOL, I just used the having baby comparison to starting my podcast. And she is also, get this, she is also a doula as well.
Okay. There's actually a doula podcast because I didn't realize that's kind of a new word to me, doula. Uh-huh. And I realize it's all about birthing stuff. And it's a hyper niche kind of thing. But the only people that know what it's like to go through are people that are in the same boats. There are a few of those. There's one called Adoptees On that's all about being an adopted kid. And I never realized this. There are times that people will spend months researching their biological parents and find them and get rejected again. And I was like, oh, does that really happen? But if you are somebody who's gone through that, you can help somebody who's going through that same thing. So I always love these little hyper niche podcasts.
What's the most, what's one that really stood out? It was really niche, that just off the wall that you were.
Hands down, Chameleon Breeder.
Chameleon Breeder.
Yeah. Wow. He does the chameleon breeding podcast. And here's the beauty of it. He does it because he builds cages for chameleons and he's like a chameleon guru. And his audience has said, we could buy cages from overseas and they'd be a lot cheaper, but because you've given so much to our community, we're going to buy them from you. And that's the lovely the law of reciprocity.
Right.
So this is where I've done something nice for you. I feel indebted to do something nice for you. But yeah, Chameleon Breeders is I'm like, okay, you take there for a while. There was one living with herpes, another one that goes back to only people would understand that. But when I heard Chameleon Breed, I'm like, I think you win an award. That's that's up there. I need to look up Pygmy Pony. I always make that up as a fake podcast, but I'm sure there's probably a Pygmy Pony podcast. I'll have to look.
Oh, that's all. Where do you, a couple questions. I'll let you get back to your Saturday night here.
Oh, we're good.
Where, I mean, would you taking you, I mean, with you, with Lisbon, and you're dealing with so many questions from people on a regular basis. Do you think sometimes people just don't listen, or don't pay attention to little things, or is common sense not as common as we would like it to be?
Well, I know when I buy a bookcase, I don't read the directions. I start to put it together, and then I'm like, then I finally go back to the directions. And I think what happens is we hear these stories of either people making an impact on a community or whatever, and you're like, man, I got to start a podcast. So you jump in, and then you're like, I probably the question I get more than any is, and I'm sure every media host gets this. I work at Libsyn, and they'll say, hey, I just created my first episode and I don't see it in Apple yet. And it's like, okay. And that's nothing wrong with that question. They just don't understand how podcasting works. So I explain, it's like, here's the deal. First of all, you don't even have any artwork yet. A couple things you miss, because you need an artwork, you need episodes, you need a description, and then you submit it to Apple and Spotify and Stitcher and all the other places, because those are really just mirrors of whatever you're using, whether it be Libsyn or Blueberry, whoever. And so when I change something in your media host, it will eventually reflect in Apple. So that's one I see a lot, and it's just like, all right, which is great, because it's somebody's jumped in because of their passion, and you need that passion when you first start out. I always say you need the passion. For a while when I was married, I had a stepson that was 16, and every time I walked in the door, he's like, can we go driving? Can we go driving? Because he wanted his license. And I say, that's the passion you need, because when you first start out and you're not a big celebrity, you don't have a big social following, and you put out that first episode, and counting your cousins, you had 22 downloads. You're like, man, that took me 6 hours and I got 22 downloads. It's that passion that's going to push you through to the next one and the next one and the next one. And plus, when you look back, when you get to episode 10 and you listen to episode 1 and you go, ew, that's perfectly normal.
Yeah.
So,
what's any advice, counsel for somebody that's going through pod fade? Or trying to, is maybe like, I've knew this for a while and I'm just not seeing what I want to, or maybe they're just running out of motivation on things.
Yeah.
Any advice?
There are a couple of things. Always go back to who's your audience and why am I doing this? And because sometimes, like I said, I've seen people pod fade. I had a friend of mine once that was doing the show, and it's inspirational stories. And I asked her, I said, like, why are you doing this? And she goes, well, I'm hoping to get some clients out of it, maybe some speaking gigs. I said, I've known you for a year. I never knew you wanted to be a speaker. And she goes, oh yeah, that's actually, I've got, you never mentioned that in your podcast. So sometimes you kind of assume people know what you're doing it for. You kind of have to be a little more obvious, because that will lead to burnout. You're like, I've been doing this for 8 months. I'm not getting anything. Well, you're not asking for it. So that's part of it. In some cases, it's just a matter of, it might just be shortening the show. If you're like, look, before now I got to take the kids to soccer and this like that. Well, instead of doing a 40-minute show, do a 20-minute show and keep going. But there is going to be a time when you just go, I did a show for musicians for 11 years. And after 11 years, I'm like, I don't know how many more times I can say, always pay your bar tab, pay attention to your audience, be professional, follow you, whatever, there's just, after a while, you're like, okay, I think I'm done here. I did a show for like people that do their own web design, and it was called Weekly Web Tools. And after a while, like, I have reviewed every web tool on the internet. I'm done. And I kept I remember the last episode, I spent like an hour and I found something that was like, yeah, I guess this will work. And I'm like, no, I don't want to put out kind of content. And I'm like, you know what? This isn't fun anymore. And I just went, that's okay. We'll put this one down and we'll start another podcast. And I just let my audience know, hey, I'm not doing this one anymore. But if you want to lose weight, come visit me at logicalweightloss.com. So, and they do. That's the other thing. I had, for a while, when I did the musicians podcast, and I've always done the school of podcasting, I had people come to the musicians podcast and I'm like, oh, I didn't know you played. And they're like, oh, I don't. I just think you're funny. And I was like, wait, what? So they come for the content, but they kind of stay for the host after a while.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could definitely see that and understand that and feel that with ours that are going on. So, well, cool, Dave. Well, hey, I appreciate you coming on and really deliver some great stuff tonight on the Mass Media Podcast Summit. You're going to be speaking in Houston at the Spark
Yeah.
Christian podcaster in a couple of weeks. We'll be headed out there as well too. And then Podfest in March in Orlando.
Yep, I'll be speaking there. I'll be part of. There's a little mini event the day before, kind of a podcasting 101, where I'm talking about how to set up your podcast. And somewhere, I'm not sure, I'm doing a very interactive example where it's so weird I can't really talk about it. But if you see it, it's if you see me, it's a really interactive thing, and you basically walk in and you find out that all the fears that you have about starting your podcast, so does everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
That's the bottom line. So,
awesome.
But yeah, Podfest. I'll be at Podcast Movement Evolutions. If you're in San Francisco, I will be at the Bay Area Independent Publishers Association speaking on podcasting. So that's the thing I love. It's about the time I get tired of doing tickets. Not that I ever get tired of doing tickets, of course, but if I ever did, I go and travel and do speaking gigs. And about the time I'm tired of taking off my shoes to get on a plane, I go home and do tickets. So it's the best of both worlds.
There you go. Now you also run the Northern Ohio Podcasters Association as well too?
Yeah, Northeast Ohio Podcasters Meetup. If you go to anyohiopodcasters.com, and we meet, I think it's the third Monday of every month. And in the winter, we actually do them online. So, and I think this month or next month, we're having David Hooper, who's the author of the Big Podcast book, going to come in and do a kind of a guest speaking thing there. So it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, definitely. Well, hey, man, thank you so much for coming on here again, man. And I'll see you in Houston in a couple of weeks. All right.
Look forward to seeing you.
Yeah,
thanks so much.
Here, have a great day. Thanks, Dave.
You too. Bye-bye.
All right, guys.